When Reah Bravo began working for The Charlie Rose Show, she believed she'd landed her dream job, producing segments for the highly respected program on PBS. But behind the scenes, she quickly found herself navigating a toxic work environment, one that would eventually be hit with a major spotlight by the Me Too movement in 2017, when 8 women, including Reah, alleged sexual harassment. In her challenging and thought-provoking book, Complicit, Reah doesn't just share her story. She examines the cultural programming we receive that enables and even encourages this type of behavior. She questions the media's coverage of the Me Too movement, exploring how the very narratives claiming to empower women often fail them. One thing is certain: Reah Bravo's work will make you rethink the stories we've been told about abuse, power, and consent. Stay tuned. This is an episode you won't want to miss. All right, everybody, welcome back to the Preacher Boys podcast. Reah, thank you so much for joining me on today's show.
Thanks for having me.
I think right out of the gate, it's important to kind of establish a definition of a word here, because you have a title for your book that, if taken the wrong way, can come across accusatory or victim blaming. You talk about that over and over again in the book. That's your plea in the beginning of the book, is like, do not take it this way. So for somebody listening who's already on edge, ready to just like pounce on this, can you give us the definition of complicity in your book and what you're really addressing here?
I approached the topic of our complicity in abuse as unintentional, and come from the standpoint that complicity is at its most insidious when it's unintentional, right? When it's not some egregious act of support, where somebody has actively made a decision, but rather it's the ways in which we fall back on assumptions and explanations, the ways in which we react to the world as it's been scripted by a white supremacist patriarchal society. And I try to illuminate for the reader all of the ways in which our culture has conditioned us to be complicit in these systems that make things ripe for abuse.
Right. There's a lot to unpack with just that definition. But I'm curious, like, first and foremost, going into this book, it is such a tightrope. And it's one of the things I appreciate about your book is that there is so much good tension throughout it, where you read one line and I start taking notes, and then you read the next line and it illuminates the past line. And it does a really good job, I think, of not just dropping a bomb and then leaving it and letting you figure it out. It's like, and here's why I said that, and here's why I said this. You talk about this in your book as well, but I also want to ask this because it's probably the next question on people's mind, which is, with how much doubt is cast on victims in, say, the wake of the Me Too movement, or just in any of these cases in general, why enter this space and navigate such a really difficult and, like I said, really tense topic?
I appreciate that question because, when women when victims, regardless of their gender, for so long have come forward, but especially women, and have been doubted and shamed and shunned, it's right for somebody to ask, why do anything to question their story? And as I try to make clear from the beginning, it's not to question the veracity. It's to try to examine things that can lead to more insight about the sources of our own vulnerability. I describe the Me Too movement for me was very much like an ayahuasca moment. I compare it to psychedelics and the way people talk about psychedelics, which is that you're suddenly removed from past experiences and you're able to understand them much more clearly and comprehensively than you ever were before. And for many of us, the effects of the first person testimony from so many women talking about how they were treated, you hear it, and we knew that the world was sexist and unfair and cruel, but suddenly it's like you could see the gestalt. You so much more came into picture. And for so many, myself and for so many women I talked to, it was the first time that we didn't blame ourselves for what happened, right? We could see a structure, we could see a system of deference, we could see all these coping mechanisms that we had used and reasoning that we had used to give ourselves, whether it was in the moment or long in the aftermath, um, the capacity to live with things
Yeah.
that had unfolded as we didn't want them to. So, yes, women, especially now, we're living in a pretty fierce backlash. And my goal is not to call into question the veracity of women. As I note a statistic early on in my book about how rape remains easier to get away with in the United States than robbery, largely because from the very beginning, the moment a woman reports her crime, she confronts an entire system that does not believe her. Which is to say nothing of the entire level of also self-doubt that so many people deal with, who wind up questioning themselves in really difficult moments. So, yeah, my objective again is not to discredit accusers, but rather to say that Me Too in and of itself offered such an opportunity to see the world differently. And it's only in our nature, as we've been conditioned to just like move on and return to seeing the world somewhat as we did before. But if we can go back and revisit and parse things further apart, I think there's a lot to glean for the betterment of all of us.
I want to kind of talk about the sources of vulnerability you just mentioned, because that's kind of what this all comes from. It's like, what are
Mhm.
these things that allow this to happen over and over again? The Harvey Weinsteins, the Louis C.K. story you mentioned in the book, so many of these photocopy stories of abuse. What are some of those key sources of vulnerability that you think contribute to these abusive cultures?
Okay, well, one of the key sources, and this is certainly true with my understanding of cults, um, despite that my background doesn't, I don't think yet, who knows, has incorporated one. But one is just our worship and our understanding of the world in terms of character, and more specifically, male greatness, and the extent to which we just, our, our cultural narratives, um, our our aspirations in life, professionally, what have you. So much of it um, comes to center, certainly in American society, around these men who we have taken their quote unquote genius as canon, right? And in the book, for all its usage and misusage in popular culture, male narcissism has to be addressed. Like I don't think you can understand how this continues to repeatedly happen without looking at the ways in which our culture is just duped by male narcissists time again. I mean, we can call it out, but there's always there's always the male narcissist du jour that we can point to and like bemoan him. But time and again, our inclination is to conflate these qualities that many powerful men project in the workplace, in our communities, that for leadership and for having the tenacity that it takes to get things done, when in reality, time and again, they don't equate to success in the workplace, and they also lead to very abusive environments. And this is, this, I'm sure many people have a sense of what I might be talking about, but men who believe in their, you know, unparalleled greatness, and who demand your loyalty if you're going to be around them. That's like the terms of engagement. Who, um, yeah, and um, who want to be surrounded by people of equal greatness, and who really have the ability in this specific kind of abuse to make people feel beholden to them. It's like with a narcissist, you are either with them or you're against them,
Yeah.
or you've entirely ceased to exist to them. So you do what it takes to to make things manageable. And along the way, the price of that is what's extracted is your loyalty.
Yeah. I'm curious and I know you interviewed so many people for this book, and I know you've obviously spent so much time in lived experience, around this. I look at a lot of these examples, like I look at comedians, I look at, especially comedians, because comedians are open about it because they talk about themselves a lot. So they share these stories. And I hear a lot of male comedians say things like, I never got girls before I was a comedian, or, oh, it was such a, becoming famous, that's the only way I would have ever gotten a girl. And they say it in a kind of joking way, but there's some truth to that, right? Like now you're famous, you're on the road, there's all these things there. Do you think this personality develops? Because obviously, on some level, it doesn't broach into abusive, right? Like there's just them sharing their experience. But then you do get a Louis C.K. who's got unchecked power. He can make these phone calls. He can have the support of a ton of people and not really lose a lot of fans after doing something horrific. Do you think this is a personality that develops over time, or do you think it's something where, you know, they were always this way and now they have power and it's magnified who they are? Because, like,
Yeah,
yeah,
that's a great question. I think it's a mixture of the two. I mean, we know that. Look, and I should have said from the beginning when I mentioned male narcissist, uh, I'm not here to make armchair diagnoses. So, that I leave that to the medical professionals. I should have stated that earlier. But I will describe them. I will use the adjective narcissistic,
yeah,
and I think it's two things. We do know that certain things from men's childhood um, lead to vulnerabilities and insecurities that manifest themselves as narcissistic attributes later on in life. At the same time, uh, we live. It's not just about the individual narcissist. We live in a narcissistic culture, right? And when power becomes such an aphrodisiac that's it's just fueling it's fueling an already lousy situation. So yeah, I would say it's a mixture of the two, but time and again I will say, you see in lots of people's stories about abusive bosses, they talk about moments when when they had just achieved something great,
yeah.
um, and that was a moment when things became very severe in the treatment of their employees because it comes with this sensation of invincibility.
You mentioned the story with Charlie where, it was clear it was just about power. Like there was nothing sexually he could do, but he just wanted to evoke this feeling that he could do anything he wanted.
Mhm.
And that compounded with a, like you said, a culture of not just the workplace, but also society going like, this person is a god of interviewing. Like they're so great at this, or this person is the god of film production, or in the church context I was in, like they were literally called the man of God, like that doesn't get more narcissistic than that. So it's like that's gotta fuel an already really dangerous fire to a point where you get lost in the sauce, pretty easily to go like,
Mhm.
I must be this great because everybody's telling me from all directions.
And I will say that's also to add, that's to say nothing of the social context and the extent to which, as individuals, we are so influenced by the people around us,
Mhm.
right? That our emotions, our reactions, and so you get in these incredibly competitive environments with this male narcissistic leader at the helm, and just the amount of fear and the amount of pressure, and you see everybody else responding with everything they can to make anything happen for this man. You cannot help but think when you're in that office environment, it's just like, oh my goodness, like I am a part of this ship and I have to work as hard as I can because it's yeah, it influences you. It's inescapable. It's a subculture within the larger culture.
Can you talk a little bit about your personal experience in terms of being in that environment and like being at the point where you realize, okay, something's wrong here, but
Mhm.
there's so much inequity between the two of us where it's like the culture, culture loves him, the workplace loves him, he has unlimited power, and I'm me. Like, how do you even approach that situation?
Yes, and I don't hide the fact in the book that I was um, self-seeking in the fact that I did not want to get out of the situation until I had a line on my resume to show that I had been his producer. Because I had already in my time, I began first as an intern and then I started as an associate producer. And I wanted that on my resume before I left for a couple of reasons. Well, one, there was a financial crisis happening. This is back in 2008, and no other job was going to come along easily. Um, and two, I had already experienced just the power of dropping his name.
Yeah.
And I had seen all these other people who had worked for him who had gone on to other interesting, if not illustrious, positions, largely because they had worked for Charlie Rose. So that said, I it was I didn't want to make all of the chaos and the darkness and just the cruelty not worth it. That was kind of my
Yeah.
thinking. I needed to get that on my life. So, um, I will say that one of the things that drove me to write the book, and one of the things that was hard to parse out, and it took the Me Too movement um, for me to revisit and be able to process it, was that in the beginning, when these things happen, it is a deep, deeply human inclination to understand things in terms of your own control that you are exercising over the situation. So, as powerful as he was, as much as he was this cultural icon, and I was just starting out as this low level intern, I still, in my very first, couple of interactions with him, it was not. I mean, it was entirely self blame. Like, why did I let him do that? Right? Like, why did I not just throw up this massive boundary and tell him no or, slap him across the face? Because those were the only narratives in which I had ever heard about sexual misconduct or sexual harassment. It was one of two options. Either the woman slapped and slapped him and fled the scene, or she was up for it and she was using her sex to her advantage, which for the vast majority of cases, I'm going to go out on a limb and say they don't quite, um, they don't quite come to pass on either of those terms. And so for so many of us, I've talked to other women who worked for him, just the mere fact that we continued going to work and showing up at the office, it was like, oh my gosh, um, I must have, I only have myself to blame. Like I must have wanted it. I must have, but clearly, I mean, from a physical standpoint, this man was in his, I did not, I did not want it. I was in no way physically attracted to him whenever he would be handsy with me. Anyway, so it took a really long time, even while I was there, to realize this is not something I'm letting happen. This is something that has gotten out of my control. And the only way to make it better is to leave. And I know a lot of people there who stayed despite mistreatment from him. And I would also describe many male employees who, whether not perhaps, Charlie wasn't handsy with them, but he was certainly verbally abusive and had been very cruel to them. You stay and you compartmentalize, you separate the man from the work that you do on his behalf. For me, it was bad enough that I knew I had to get out. And so I was just waiting until um, I finally got a job because I had student loans to pay. I was living in New York. Got out as quickly as I could. But even then, I something that I think about and that I talked about recently with a former employee is for those of us who left, when we left the show, when you talk about male narcissism and also just um, our worship of these men or the power that we give them, um, everyone who left was always terrified to leave without him thinking that you somehow wanted to stay if only you could. I mean, everybody who ever left had to somehow leave on like the best of terms possible, because for him to not continue working for him was just outrageous. It was just an act of strange defiance that had no reason. But yeah, so we all took great pains to let him know that it's like, we had some reason that we had to leave to go on in life, and still wanting to maintain, even though I wanted out of there, I I wanted to maintain things on good grounds with him.
I also got the sense reading that it also is sort of an endurance test as well. Like you talk about how a lot of the former employees, used war analogies talking about working there. And, it again, it's one of the things I love about your book, and I'll try not to just compliment your book every question, but there's a lot of
Oh,
things
that's
that were
okay.
so well said. And one of the things I love is that you take away these really simple narratives that we have. And I think in terms of the entertainment business, the simple narrative is casting couch. Someone, just sleeps their way to the top. That's what you hear on the news all the time when stories are reported. You think about it in a religious context, and it's like, well, why didn't they just leave? It's a church, it's not a workplace. They can just exit. There's all these quick answers we give to feel better about what we think we would do, as you call out in the book. But it sounds like in the case of like the workplace, and particularly in the entertainment industry, it was this endurance test of, if I can stick in this, I'm proving that I am strong enough to be in this field. It doesn't just mean, oh, it's a transaction. Like I'm going to get this and then I get this. It's like, this is a rite of passage that all these
Mhm.
people before me have done. Was that really kind of how you felt along that journey?
Very much so. I mean, as you know, in the book, I write about how much we worship toughness in our culture, and this idea that we always want to prove that we have what it takes, and how that plays out in the professional realm. And so there was there's definitely a certain kinship that comes from working this hard with people and being this fearful with people in the quote unquote trenches, because so many people used war metaphors, which I acknowledge in the book can be somewhat offensive to those people who have actually served, when the majority of us on staff were these upwardly mobile white people with like Ivy degrees. Um, but certainly it was this notion of, do I have what it takes? And that you wouldn't walk away from that, because that might imply you were weak. And there's nothing that we have less respect for in our culture than weakness. And, I talked to multiple women. One woman who I think of right off the bat, she worked for Amazon. And it got to a point that these grueling hours, um, yes, she was being compensated very well, but it just wasn't worth it for her. It did not make sense, and she left. And for years after that, it pained her. It was like, did I do the wrong thing? That was I, you know, could I? Why couldn't I cut it? Right? Even though, for all practical purposes, it made no sense for her to continue there. So yes, and not only does it keep you there, but I think it can help you rationalize the the hard work you're putting in on behalf of these people, or what you're sustaining. And um, when I first started out as an intern, Charlie pulled me aside and he explained to me something that he had explained to some other women I now know, which was that he was looking for an international content producer, which was somebody he could travel with. And he wanted to make sure that you got along well. And so he would propose like an upcoming trip where he would, you could travel with him, kind of test out your relationship, which this whole the whole setup just means like, I need to find out if you're likable and I like you, right? I mean, it's just, but of course you're coming into this and you're thinking, wow, international content producer. I was, at the time I was getting my master's degree in international relations, and I was focused on the Middle East, lots of interesting stuff happening. So of course I like, what a position. Yes, I would like to test out, our potential. um, and I shared this with, I was talking about it. It came up in conversation that he had said this to me with another producer who had been there for multiple, multiple years. And he told me, yeah, he's been looking for somebody to fill that position for multiple years now. And he says this to me to kind of like wink, wink, um, this is not a position he's trying to fill. This is a story he uses to isolate young women alone with him on private jets or wherever he's off to, whatever hotel room or on his Long Island estate. I hear that and I internalize nobody else has been good enough. But if I can work harder and prepare harder, like I might be able to become his international content producer, right? It's just it's a lens that we apply to justify our behavior or to justify not just our behavior but our aspirations and what we're willing to enter into.
Yeah. Well, like you've said in the book, the American culture behind that is so strong, where we are raised with this perception of this true like meritocracy, where it's like if you're good enough, anything is possible, and it totally leaves out the fact that the system could be completely stacked against you, whether that's in a micro level like an office space or in the macro level like what zip code you're born in, all these other pieces that come into play there. And it's really like, for all the talk of grooming that I do on this show, I think a lot more conversation could be had about the grooming that you get from birth, which is like, this is what you'll see happen if you do this. And that's on both sides. Like, I would say, given the example of what you said, the woman throwing the glass in the guy's face or slapping him, you see that stereotype in 1950s movies you grew up watching. But also you
Mhm.
see, I was just recently watching a Dean Martin movie, and it's like, yeah, the movie was okay aside from what was basically a rape scene, which was supposed to be the love scene in the movie. It's like guys are being raised on that perspective too. So like
Mhm.
there's so much media and so much that tells you like if you can just hold it out, if you can just do this, if you can prove your value, what you mentioned in your book as being the workhorse and the show pony. If you can manage that balance, something really great's going to happen for you, and
Mhm.
it's just not often the case.
It's interesting that you use grooming because I gave an interview with uh, a UK based podcast, it was feminist oriented one, and I had talked about how explain my book is how our culture conditions us to either overlook or condone abuse, including our own. And I was pushed back because the idea is that maybe it's not conditioning, it might be grooming. That perhaps conditioning is too light of a term. But, you know, what you just reminded me of is I feel like there's a through line, whether it's religious fundamentalism, whether it's, the craziest of crazy cults, or whether it's like our workplaces in a hyper individualistic neoliberal American culture. I mean, the through line, it's all a patriarchy. And I think in some environments, male entitlement and women's subjugation might be more literal, right? It might come with a handbook, a playbook. And in other environments, it's far more subtle and it's what you've absorbed since birth. It's the water we've all been swimming in, right? There was a really good, too, I don't know if you saw it in the New York Times today. There's an opinion piece by David French, the conservative columnist. He writes about Me Too and the point at which it went too far, um, at least in the context of the reckoning with the Baptist Church, and how when Me Too first began, there was this sensation among conservatives that it's like, haha, look at our liberals pay the price. Like they talk the talk of being progressive and feminist and loving women, but look how abusive they are. And that was all fine until things really hit the fan for the Baptist Church
Mhm.
and for other religious fundamentalists who suddenly something was exposed. I don't need to tell you this. That was just so systemic and so heinous and so bizarre.
Yeah.
Just in its bizarre insofar that I think maybe so egregious is a better word. But yeah, that's a point that um, we have to reckon also with the fact that once justice or somebody else's um, protection requires something of you,
Yeah.
requires that you give up something, that's when people often go missing. That's when they're silent, right? Um, and it was it was an interesting take, and I think, if I recall correctly, part of the argument that he's making is that that's where Me Too is hit a wall, and that he has some grievances with Me Too, beyond that, but just that these accusations can only take us so far when people in power, people who have something that they don't want to give up, need to give that up, or question their own system for things to get better.
Right. Yeah. I wish I'd read the article because I certainly will after this.
Well, it's early there.
Um,
I have 6 hours ahead of you.
yeah, you had a head start prepping. Um, yeah, it is true. There was certainly an element, and I can talk about this from the Baptist perspective, is like I've seen it where the conservative fundamentalist side goes, well, we've been talking about the Hollywood elites forever, all the way down to the conspiracy theorists, where it's like, well, that's how you get famous is you join this cult and, all these sorts of things. And, you know, some of that, if you, depending how you want to label things, is not too far off in certain spheres, like there are certainly cultish groups and studios that operate in that way. But it it was easy to throw rocks at this behemoth that is the Hollywood system, negating the fact that much like churches, there are little subsects of that and there's environments that are completely healthy in that environment. But yes, when it comes to addressing the issues in your own space, in the Baptist space, and in your church, it got very quiet. All of a sudden, and I saw this in my childhood church. They threw so many rocks at the Catholic church in the neighborhood, and where I don't think anything ever happened. It was something that was the cliche is like Catholics do this. But when situations like that happened in our home turf, it was swept under the rug very quickly in a similar fashion. And so we always have a tendency to look at the other side.
Mm-hmm.
It just yeah, it's frustrating. Once it touches them, then they try to pass the buck to somebody else, which is
Mm-hmm.
yeah. Um, I do want to address you've mentioned the patriarchy a few times here, and you said another thing that I think is so important. It's something I've been saying a lot. I've been wanting more people to be saying, which is that patriarchy hurts everybody. I think there's a perception that you know it's great for men, and that's why men pursue it. But these narratives aren't good for anybody. Can
No.
you talk a little bit about how you've seen the patriarchy affect everybody in negative ways? And I echo so much of what you write about it in the book, but I'm curious, like, what's top of mind for you in that discussion?
Oh, I and allow me to start out by saying I really appreciate that question, because I feel like so many people, when they speak to me, they think that they're coming to a story that's about like women with pitchforks, and their torches alit on one side, against men on the other, and that this is one group, just loathing the other
Yeah.
side, who has all the power and everything to gain from keeping the status quo, which they do not. I cite, for example, that men currently in the United States are roughly 4 times more likely to take their life than women are. And that's something that the American Psychiatric Association now decisively attributes to the toll of traditional um, expectations of masculinity. Um, and, you know, growing up in a patriarchal culture like ours, um, I use the term ghost like forces, which I took from Carol Gilligan, a feminist psychologist, but it's this notion of we internalize from a very early age our role and what we need to sacrifice or what we need to take on in order to be accepted and loved. And for men, a lot of that is sacrificing the ability to have these meaningful relationships and be vulnerable and be loved. And, we all ultimately, under a patriarchal system, sacrifice our authenticity.
Yeah.
Um, so the idea, like, yes, men have more wealth and they have more powerful positions, but they are hurting too under a patriarchal system. And I think we all know of men. I know quite a few who have. I believe I see them struggling with resentment that their lives have not turned out according to what they were shown to expect, and that they do not feel that they are living up to all the expectations they have, that they're burdened by because they're a man. And also, you know, and especially, I mean, I think about this especially in regards to religious fundamentalism and ministers, preachers who you hear talk about a woman's role and God designed woman, la di da, to do this and, give her husband a foot massage after dinner. Like, in the vast history of humanity's existence, of human existence, the patriarchy has existed for a brief amount of time. We lived in egalitarian societies for far longer than we lived in patriarchal ones. And I do believe that there's a certain kind of just resignment that we have because it's just like, oh, this is the way it is. It's not. It hasn't always been this way, and there are cultures in the world right now that are not patriarchal. They happen to, maybe they're not Western, highly industrialized GDP powerhouses like the United States, but they do exist, and there's a lot to learn from. I don't know, or just inspiration to take from the idea that it doesn't have to be this way.
Yeah, well, it goes. I feel like I have too many of these conversations because I'm trying to remember where this came from, or maybe I read it somewhere. But somebody I was talking to or listening to was talking about how do you measure success and how do you measure, um, you know, like what do you value? And I think sometimes we look at, we've been programmed to look at financial or power or awareness. Awareness is probably the biggest currency right now. It's like how many people know who you are and like how much influence do you have?
Mhm.
Um, but those things aren't necessarily fulfilling. So,
Yeah.
I think of the one of the best selling, if not the best selling, I think the best selling evangelical book on relationships is The Five Love Languages. I think near that is Love and Respect, which the whole thesis of the book is that women want love, men want respect. Feed that to millions of people and see where that gets you. And, again, I think you have men, and I have conversations with peers who believe that. And they're not bad people, but they truly think like, well, we don't need as much love and emotion and we don't need as much this. I just need respect, and you have women saying, well, like, I just need to feel loved and cared for. They're both missing massive pieces of the human experience by taking that to heart. And so, yeah,
Mhm.
I just really wanted to shout that out because I think that is a piece that gets left out. I don't think it gets left out by a lot of people who are really writing about this and really looking into
Mhm.
it. I think it gets left out by the caricatures that you see on a Fox News talking about these stories, or that you see in critics of, say, a Me Too movement that aren't being, you know, well-intentioned critics. Because I think you
Mhm.
are a well-intentioned critic of a movement that is leaving a lot of things out, or at least the way it's being covered, if not the movement itself.
Mhm.
So I really appreciated that section.
Right.
I know we're getting close to the end here, but I do want to talk to you about something, and I don't know if it's been asked about in interviews, but I was so glad you mentioned it as well. The film The Assistant, you talk about in the book, and I'm so excited I want to talk about it because I've recommended it to so many people. One of my friends, who's a survivor of abuse in a religious context, watched it and loved it. Um, I think it demonstrates so much. It's almost a companion piece to your book, in how well it captures these things. What stood out most to you about that film, and why do you think it's something people should watch when trying to understand these topics?
Well, I'm glad you asked about this film, which I think is a masterpiece, and
Yeah, same.
which I had nothing to do with the film. I just write about it because it does such an amazing job. It was Kitty Green's film. Yeah, it just does an incredible job of capturing the day in the life of a devoted employee who works for an unhinged abuser.
Yeah.
and just the absolute weight of that and the stress. And the point I make about that book, the point I make about the movie in my book, and Kitty Green interviewed like I don't know, I don't remember how many hundreds of people who had worked for very powerful men as their assistants in her crafting of the movie. Um, I bring it up because the assistant in that movie is incredibly dutiful, and
Yeah.
she is unquestionably complicit. You know, she throws away used syringes. I mean, she did, to her credit in the movie, she does go to HR and she tries to report it, and HR is, um, makes her second guess herself, and ultimately she doesn't um, make a complaint. But for me, you watch that movie, and the assistant is, if anything, good. Because in our culture, we conflate being a good worker with a good person.
Yeah.
And I would never watch that movie and think, oh, she is heinous. Like, I
Yeah.
cannot believe she's doing this. Like, and what's interesting too is my husband has never worked in an environment like he's worked in some pretty, fast paced, high pressure environments, but never like the one I was at Charlie Rose. And we watched that movie and I was so affected. And he was like, uh-huh. Kind of like, okay. And I did sometimes wonder, how much of that movie was made to resonate more with women than with men. I don't know, but it was just so affecting for me to see that.
Yeah. Yeah. That HR meeting where he talks to her and says, "What are your goals?" And she says, "I want to be a producer." And he's like, "Oh, it's good. We need more female producers." And he says his demeanor changes and he says, "Why are you going to throw it away over all this bullshit?" And
Mhm.
it's like it's such a it's such a great example of a character who is complicit. And I think for anybody who's listening to this, that should be your immediate watch after this to understand this context is, you know, it you're complicit, but you're a victim of the system in
Mhm.
such a way. And it was funny. I watched it with my wife, and she had a similar experience. And every review I read was one of the two. It's like I was on the edge of my seat. My skin was crawling the whole time. It was such a
Mhm.
brutal watch. And then other people were like, "What's the point? Just drug on, because you really are watching someone do office work, with little glimpses of something. And
Mhm.
in any other movie, it would explode, but this movie doesn't. It just carries on. And my wife said something like, "Oh, I keep waiting for it to." I forget what she said. She's like, "I kept waiting for it to hit this peak," and I said, "I think that's kind of the point. It's like the mundane nature of it is what's kind of horrifying. It's like it's
Mhm.
just
Mhm.
exactly what your quote is, which is like being good at the job implies this integrity about me, and that whole movie is her not wanting to release that perceived integrity that she has by
Mhm.
sticking out. And so,
Mhm.
anyway, I wanted to point that
You know,
out because it's yeah,
and also just I appreciate your description of the assistant insofar that something that I haven't explicitly stated, which is that you can be both a victim
hmm
and complicit,
yeah,
which is
yeah,
fundamental to the argument I make in my book.
yeah. This might be a really good last question, and it's something I personally struggle with a lot. And like you say in the book, we've got our own narratives, and so we can paint ourselves as the hero at times, and then at other times, obviously, we feel this overwhelming guilt because we were part of this, and like it's a roller coaster, for lack of a better word. Um, one of the things for me is I can feel a lot of guilt for participating in these environments. However, I was, you know, I was a minor for a lot of that period of times growing up in religious fundamentalism. So I saw a lot of this stuff, but I wasn't, very early on in my position as an adult, I did half by choice, half because I was ejected from it very brutally, left that environment. And I'm thankful that I was ejected the way I was. But sometimes I have a really hard time looking at the adults in my life. And on a really good day, I can have a charitable reading and look at them as complicit and a victim of a system that was steamrolling them constantly. But a lot of times I do feel this rage of why did these adult figures in this environment not do anything, not say anything? What would you say to those who are holding that space in their mind right now, who can look at the people who did stay and go, you know, how can they see them in a more fleshed out way,
Hmm.
I guess?
Hmm.
Not the
Hmm.
direct abuser, like not the Harvey Weinstein necessarily,
Yeah.
but
No,
the
no.
people around them, you know?
Well, I I believe that sometimes these scenarios for individuals it can feel as though they've passed a point of no return, whether they intellectualize that or not. But if you have been a part of a community for a very long time, if you have known of certain things for a very long time, the more time that goes by, the actually the harder it becomes um, to take a step back and to say this is all wrong because it's that much more of a threat to your own sense of self. Um, and so that's you know that's my perspective on it. It's not to say that you know everybody gets a pass, but just that there's a certain, we all have our coping mechanisms. And I think those coping mechanisms, the longer things have gone on, um, sometimes the more elaborate and perverse those coping mechanisms can become. And
Yeah.
I think we're seeing that in so many realms of our lives right now. I think people are doubling down on whatever narrative they need to justify the cruelty in their world while those narratives are also failing us or being challenged. I don't think it's just, workplaces or fundamentalist churches. I think it's our political economic system, it's our political system, it's many things that are not working. And when faced with that reality, people double down on whatever inadequate narrative they have
Right.
to justify their own being.
Yeah. Even
Yeah.
marriages, it's
Yeah.
the
Yes.
sunk cost fallacy of, well, we're 20 years in, and
Hmm.
you get so good at telling yourself, oppressing yourself as you put it, like it
Hmm.
and telling yourself this narrative that makes it okay in a really demented way in a lot of these
Hmm.
environments. Well, I mean, I hope this isn't the last time we talk because there's a
Oh, I'd love to
billion
talk again.
notes I have, and I was like going through like, what do I want to ask the most? But truly, like I said, your book is such a tightrope through so many tense topics, and I really it's rocketed up my list of book recommendations because I think it does a great job of not just saying really, just the title alone is could be so incendiary and be enough to get a book to somebody, but the fact that you can draw such a thread through all these stories is really powerful, and I'm really going to be sitting with a lot of it for a long time. So thank you for writing it. Thank you for talking to me. And like I said, I hope it's not the last time we chat.
Well, I hope we chat again too. Thank you.